Hello, I'm Chuck Wolf, Chief Executive for Charles J. Wolf Associates, LLC. As a motivational speaker and a leadership consultant and executive coach and trainer, I often work with very successful people in their companies. Since many can't afford a professional, I volunteer to host a radio talk show called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel, on a nonprofit community radio station in Bridgeport, Connecticut, WPKN. My reason for doing the show is to share with as many people as possible this wonderful process for helping people manage their own emotions and their relationships with others. My goal is for everyone listening to learn to use the Emotion Roadmap to make life better. As you listen to me, help others, I hope you are also learning. As a Simsbury resident, I'm delighted to be able to make the show available through Simsbury TV. To learn more, go to my website, www.emotionroadmap.com. Thank you for listening and watching.
Hi, I'm Chuck Wolf, and you're listening to the Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel on WPKN 89.5 FM community radio station. And I'm delighted to have with me today a guest, Deborah Tannen, who I will tell you more about in just a moment. But I can tell you I'm a personal fan of many of the things that she's written, and just really pleased that she's taken the time to be with us today. And so I want to tell you a little bit about the show, though, for those of you who are new listeners. The show is about helping people understand how to manage their own emotions and how to influence the relationships with others by paying attention to how other people feel. And some of what Deborah has written about, I think, really plays to that. And I think you're going to learn a lot. And I hope that many of you are going to want to read a whole bunch of her books when we're all done talking to her today. Deborah is a university professor and professor of linguistics at Georgetown University, author of many books and articles about how the language of everyday conversation affects relationships. The most recent is Finding My Father, His Century-Long Journey from World War I Warsaw and My Quest to Follow. Of her previous books, the best known is You Just Don't Understand, Women and Men in Conversation, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for nearly 4 years, including 8 months as #1, and has been translated into 31 languages. Her books, You Were Always Mom's Favorite, Sisters in Conversation Throughout Their Lives, and You're Wearing That, Understanding Mothers and Daughters in Conversation, were also New York Times bestsellers. Talking from 9 to 5, Women and Men at Work, was a New York Times business bestseller, and one I really want to spend some extra time talking about because I think it's so helpful, even in today's world, for women and men to understand a lot of what's in that book. The Argument Culture, which I only read recently, which was written a number of years ago, but it's so important for today's world. Stopping America's War of Words received the Common Ground Book Award. And I only say this because I love you. Talking to Your Parents, Partners, Sibs, and Kids When You're All Adults received a Books for a Better Life Award. Deborah has been a guest on such television and radio shows and information shows as Good Morning America, The Today Show, PBS NewsHour, Oprah, and many shows on NPR. She's been featured in and written for major newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Newsweek, USA Today, People, and the Harvard Business Review. Deborah is one of the only 6 in Georgetown University's College of Arts and Sciences who hold the distinguished rank of university professor. In addition, she has also held key positions at Princeton and Stanford. She has also published poems, short stories, and personal essays, and her first play, An Act of Devotion, is included in the Best American Short Plays 1993 to 94. It was produced together with her play Sisters by Horizons Theater in Arlington, Virginia. I would like to give all of you listening a chance to hear her talk a few moments about each of her books, and then focus on at least 3, Talking 9 to 5, and The Argument Culture, and her newest book, Finding My Father. So with that, I'll turn it over to Deborah to tell you a little bit about her books. We talked about what we do in this interview, and we decided one of the best things would be for her to just give you sort of a history of how each of the books came about and how they led one to another. So Deborah, I turn it over to you. And thanks again for being here.
So thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here on your show. As you said, it was my book, You Just Don't Understand, about how women and men communicate, that got a lot of attention. Certainly caught me off guard that it got that much attention. But actually, the book that I wrote before that was the book for which I had, I would say, outside ambitions. And that was a book called That's Not What I Meant. Subtitle, How Conversational Style Makes or Breaks Your Relations with Others. We know when we talk to each other, we have to say what we mean. And we do. Sometimes I'm asked, wouldn't this be a better world if people just said what they mean? And I usually say, well, we do, but we say it in our own conversational style. So you talk to someone whose conversational style is relatively similar, chances are they're going to know how you mean what you said, and you're going to pretty much know how they mean what they say. And this is really important, you will get accurate impressions of each other. If you talk to someone whose conversational style is different, and that could be because of ethnic background, regional background, where you grew up, the culture you come from, and whether you're male or female, it's also an influence. If you talk to someone whose conversational style is different, the chances are great that they know what you said, they speak the language, but they don't know how you mean what you said. And they may come away with wrong impressions of your intentions toward them, of your abilities. So just a couple of quick examples of that. Let's say there's a couple, they come from different parts of the country, and one complains to the other, your parents aren't interested in me. They never asked me any questions. And the other one complains, gee, well, when we visit your parents, it's like an interrogation. They're always bombarding me with questions. Well, is asking personal questions intrusive, or is it a sign of interest? Anytime two people talk, they have to know when it's your turn and when it's my turn. And one way that we gauge when someone else is ready to stop their turn and give the floor over to you is how long they pause. It turns out that a conversational style difference is how long a pause you think is normal between turns. So anytime two people talk, and if there's a difference, let's say one expects this much pause and the other expects this much pause, what happens? This much pause comes first. And that person starts thinking, this conversation is running down, you're not saying anything. I'll be a nice person, I'll take the floor. And if it happens again and again, you end up doing all the talking. And you don't walk away thinking, gee, I think we had a slightly millisecond difference in how long a pause we expect between turns. You draw conclusions about the person's intentions and the kind of person they are. You don't want to hear me talk, you just want to hear yourself talk, or you're not interested in me, or you have nothing to say, you're making me do all the work here. And that is something that, yeah.
So let me stop you and just say that I've had that experience. I resemble that remark. It was very recent, actually, with a woman from Texas who takes long pauses in what she's saying, and it's sort of sometimes where I've made the mistake at the symphony when I thought the symphony was done, and I start to applaud, and it's not done, and it's just a break. And it's the same thing with my conversation with her, and I've had that experience where she actually, we had a conversation offline about it because. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. I will now wait. I will wait much longer now than I normally. I'm from Massachusetts. We talk fast. I grew up, if you weren't talking, it was my turn.
That's the key. That's so perfect. And the key is what you said, if you're not talking. How do you make that conclusion? You're not talking. Right. And that's a perfect example, right? And this even happens among people who are married to each other, live together, who have known each other a long time. So that was one of many, many aspects of conversational style that I wrote about in the book. That's Not What I Meant. Obviously, there are many others as well. That book had one chapter on conversations between women and men, conversational style, his and hers. It was not the focus of my research up until that point, but others had done research on it, and I was familiar with it, and I had a chapter on that. That was the chapter everybody wanted to talk about. And that's why I decided, okay, I'll write my next book about that. And I had scaled back my ambitions. I'm not going to change the world. Somebody said to me, your book just needs to do well enough that they let you write another one. So I felt, okay, I've hit that plateau. And so I wrote You Just Don't Understand, conversations between women and men. And that was a complete surprise. Many of you have heard the joke, references to why don't men stop and ask for directions? Believe it or not, that comes from my book. Before I wrote You Just Don't Understand, nobody talked about that. It was something a lot of people picked up in the interviews about the book. And my take on why that is comes down to a pattern that I had observed. Whenever we talk to each other, we always have to balance who's up, who's down, maybe relative status, hierarchy, and how close or distant are we. And there seemed to be a tendency for the same conversation for women to walk away asking, has this brought us closer or pushed us farther apart? And for men to walk away asking, has this put me in a one up or a one down position? And obviously we're both interested in both, but it's just relative focus. So just a very quick example, a woman whose husband called up Friday night and he said, my friend's in town, so I'm going to go have dinner with him. And she was kind of hurt. What if I had plans or something? How come you didn't check with me first? And he said, I can't tell my friend. I need to ask my wife for permission. That's the status approach to it. She didn't think it had anything to do with permission. She thought we're connected. And she would be pleased to tell her friend, I'm connected to somebody. What I do has an impact on him, so I'm going to check. And so another pattern for many women, and this goes, I trace the patterns that I observed to the way kids learn to use language growing up. And from the time little girls are very young, they tend to have a best friend. They spend a lot of time sitting and talking and telling secrets. And the way I put it is, talk is the glue that holds that relationship together. Your best friend is the one you tell everything to. The boys seem to focus more on activities. Your best friend is the one you do everything with. And if there's a fight, he'll be on your side. And so that leads to this frustration. It was one of the things I wrote about that got picked up a lot from that book, the end of day conversation, where she might ask, how was your day? And he asks her, how was your day? Well, she answers what she did, where she went, who she talked to, what they said, what that made her think, what that made her feel. And then in answer to her question, how was your day? Nothing much, same old rat race. But then they go out to dinner with another couple, and guess what? He's telling them about this funny thing that happened during the day. And she feels hurt by that. What am I, chopped liver? And I explained it as this difference in the role of talk, that for her, we tell what's happening as a way of creating closeness. And for many men, and none of these things, very important to say, nothing is 100%, 0%, all men, all women. We're just talking about tendencies and patterns. But that for many men, just being together, that's closeness. But you don't really have to tell stories unless you're with other people and that you need to entertain them to show that you're taking your part in the conversation and get the respect and attention you deserve.
Let me just interrupt and just to tell you that, so I don't know, it was 20 some years ago probably that you Just Don't Understand came out. And at that point, I asked myself the question about why I wasn't asking directions. And I didn't have a good answer. Ever since been asking directions when I don't know.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. I should have explained why I used that example. It's this connection versus status that for many women, well, you make a fleeting connection to a stranger, you get where you're going, you didn't lose anything. And for many men, it's uncomfortable because you're putting yourself in a one down position to a stranger. I'm lost, can you help me? Now, most men will tell me that's not it at all. They probably don't know either, and they're going to tell me the wrong thing. But that's
as a person who has 3 son-in-laws, I can tell you it feels that way. I don't want to tell somebody where they're going because I don't want to be the one who's right even. It's just crazy, but.
No, it definitely, absolutely, that happens. But it's interesting to me that women I've never had a woman say to me, well, it's not good to ask directions because someone won't know and they won't admit it. They'll tell you the wrong thing. And that's another pattern that women are more likely to say, oh, I don't know. So for each of these books, I could talk for 2 hours. So I'm going to try to just hit the highlights about each. So after that book, people said to me, but what about the workplace? I spend more time at work than I do at home. And so I wrote the book, Talking from 9 to 5, about the workplace. And for that book, I actually went to work every day in two large workplaces, one on the East Coast, one in California. I got to know everybody in these organizations. I also visited some other organizations for a shorter period of time, but these big ones, got to know the organization extremely well. And I had 4 people in each place carry or wear a tape recorder and record everything they said for a week. And then I had it transcribed, and then I shadowed each of those 4 people so that I got to know them, their peers, their superiors, their subordinates, right up to the CEOs in both cases. I ended up really coming up with what I have written about so much since, the double bind that women in positions of authority find themselves in. I did focus in particular on women in positions of authority, that is management. And a double bind is different from a double standard. A double standard is unfair. You're being held to a different standard, but you can meet that standard. A double bind is a no-win situation. You have 2 sets of requirements, and anything you do to fulfill one set of requirements actually violates the other. So whatever you do, you're doing something wrong because you're violating one or the other. In the workplace, in positions of authority, the 2 sets of requirements are speak like a boss, like a person in authority, and speak like a woman. Because if you're not a good woman, people aren't going to like you. If you're not a good boss, they're not going to respect you. These requirements of a good boss, a good person in authority, I don't mean a good boss as in, you treat your subordinates well, but the kind of ways of speaking that a person in authority is expected to use are: be sure of yourself, be confident, tell people what to do in an assertive sort of way, tell people what you're good at. All of those things are unacceptable to be a good woman. You're supposed to be self-effacing. You're not supposed to talk too much. You're not supposed to tell people what to do in a very direct way. Even girls, you don't hear them saying, give me that, throw that away. No, go over there. They'll say things like, let's do this. let's do that. They know who's boss. They'll listen to the high status girl that says, let's, but they don't speak in that imperative way. So women in these positions of authority are in a double bind. If they talk in ways expected of women, then they're seen as lacking confidence as a boss. If they talk in ways expected of a person in authority, they're seen as too aggressive. And I'll give you just a quick example. I was in one of these places. I was actually giving a talk at a women's college, and the president of the college told me, she was the first woman president, even though it was a women's college. She had been overheard by a member of the board of trustees saying to her assistant something like, could you do me a favor? And went on to tell her to do something. And the board of trustees member took her aside, guy, and said, don't forget, you're the president. He felt that by using the expression, could you do me a favor? She was lacking confidence. She wasn't talking with authority. She told me this story in front of her assistant. The assistant said, but I like that she talks to me that way. I know what she wants and I'm going to do it. But that's an example of where she was communicating with her female assistant in a way that didn't seem to demand it, but she was seen as lacking confidence. And by the way, you see this all the time with women in public life. Women running for office, they're either seen as too aggressive or they're seen as less competent. And lots of
yeah, I noticed that you have been in Harvard Business Review. I really like that that magazine, the journal, quite a bit. And recently they had something about women who aren't making it through the glass ceiling, which is also in this book. You've got a chapter on that. And what they wrote was pretty disturbing to me. They found, this is like this past year, 2020, that people are partly not making it because of childcare, and that they make choices because of childcare that they don't take as advanced a position as they might if they weren't involved with childcare. Now, what's curious is that that's true of women who don't have children. That doesn't hold water. But people seem to have this imagination of what actually is happening. Where I found in what you wrote about, which is this whole idea of this indirect language, this we instead of I, this less the focus of not taking ownership of your ideas and presenting them as I did this, and allowing others to say that, and even promoting people who work for you to say that, so that you promote your team. And people might love working for a woman boss, but the people above them look at them and say, you're not the person I'm looking for, which, by the way, is not, if you look at the way vision statements are written and mission statements are written, and all these organizations, they say, we value our people, but not really, not in the way that, if you're really looking at how people are leading, and you recognize that when a woman doesn't necessarily tell someone the answer, because they don't want to embarrass them, or they want to help them to grow, or they're trying to teach them and help them to feel confidence themselves, it's a demerit. It counts against them in the promotion scale, and they don't look decisive and they don't look competent. And I'd love for you to say more about that, because that's still very much happening today. And I think that's so much more real than what I read in Harvard Business Review this past year about why women aren't making it into that class, above that glass ceiling in so many places.
Yes, absolutely. And it is definitely disheartening that it is still so true, because the book was written quite a few years ago. I guess you'd have to say it's a matter of unconscious bias, perhaps. But again, I think the double bind is more significant than we realize. So women have told me quite recently that they are told, you have to take ownership of your ideas. But then when they do, they're told, don't be so full of yourself.
It's
and
not
there's
very
so many
feminine,
other,
right?
yeah, there's so many other ways like that. I've written quite a bit about apologies. For example, women will often say, I'm sorry, and be told, don't apologize. It's not your fault. But they weren't apologizing. They were saying, I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah.
So it's a way of showing concern for the other person, but it can be heard as she thinks everything's her fault. I actually talked to a woman, though, who told me when she was promoted, she talked the way her boss had talked, and she did not say, I'm sorry, didn't make small talk, didn't say, if, for example, if she came to a meeting, a little bit late, she wouldn't say, I'm sorry, she just came in. And she was criticized. She found she got a better response when she started saying, I'm sorry, more often, because it was expected. We are so used to hearing women and men talk in a certain way that it rubs us the wrong way when they don't fulfill those expectations. I think it takes a very concerted effort. I'll give you another example from the place where I was doing my work. So one of the women I followed around was quite high ranking. So the guy beneath her, right just below her in the hierarchy, had to choose someone to promote from the people below him. And he was telling her who he was thinking of recommending for promotion. And she said, well, how about this woman on your team? What about her? And he said, oh, she doesn't want to be promoted. And so this higher up said, well, ask her. And he came back, he said, gee, you're right. She did want it. Why did he think she didn't want it? She had been clearly trying not to be self-promoting. And another thing I observed in that research, people who got promoted tended to be people who were already acting in ways that, as if they had that higher job, higher position. And they were often not liked that well by their peers. I think the feeling that you're not liked by your peers can be harder, I think, often for women than for men, because this connection is so important. So many other things we could talk
Well,
about.
let me
there,
ask you again. There's another one. I don't want to spend too much time just on this book because I want to leave time for the others. But I do want to mention the other one too, because there's such a, equality in pay is still an issue. We're still looking at constitutional amendments and all these crazy things to try and get that to happen. But in the research you talked about in that book, you talked about in negotiations, unrelated to anything other than you're just giving a script and you just have to role play. Women and men with the same kind of scenarios landed up with, a supervisor talking to an employee about what they're going to pay them to be in this job. The women seem to always have lower pay coming out. And this has nothing to do with anything except an experiment that you did. And so it's because I think, like in classes, I know this from I have 3 daughters. 2 of whom are in corporations, so this is very important stuff to me. And I remember my daughter, who's a PhD in chemistry, saying that she never, the idea of how she bragged about what she thought she got on the test. She might think that, but she didn't brag about it like the people sitting beside her. And then when the test came back and she saw how much better she did than most of the guys in her class, it was like, but they all were so confident. And that's missing too. And I remember I was taught by a master negotiator years ago when I worked with Exxon, Chester Karras. He said that, you're paid not what you're worth, you're paid what you negotiate. And I thought of your experiment when I was looking at it and reading about that. So you went to
yes, that's so true. And I would even say, I don't even know if those guys are so confident. We don't know what's inside, how confident people are, but we only know how they talk about it. And many guys have been, have just learned over time, you're supposed to talk as if you're confident, whether you are. By the way, the CEO of another organization where I spent some time hanging out, he said, people come to me and I have to make a decision in 5 minutes about something they've worked on for 5 months. And he said, I decide by how confident they are. If they seem confident, I say do it. If they don't, then I say no. And I am thinking, uh-oh, because some people may feel very confident, but they're not going to say, do this. I know it's going to be great. To the best of the research I've done, it should work. But of course, there's no guarantee. That may sound unconfident. You have to know the person and what their style is. But the study you're referring to was so relevant, just like what you're saying about your daughter. This was 2 different conditions. They asked people to predict their grade, what grade they're going to get in the class. But in one case, it was public, say it in front of the class. And the other was write it on a piece of paper, seal it in an envelope, collect the envelopes. The ones who did it privately, the women were quite accurate. The ones that did it publicly, they predicted a lower grade than they actually got.
Yeah.
And again, this is not unrealistic because they are going to get a negative response if they talk in a way that sounds self-promoting.
So that's the double bind you're talking about.
That's the double bind.
And that's why it hasn't changed yet. So I'm always thinking about how do you change people's feelings around things, right? I never believe it's impossible to change, but look at all the years that have gone by and we're still trying to figure out why aren't women advancing? And partly it's because they can't self-promote, even though it's what you're supposed to do in terms of what it looks like. So
Absolutely.
Let me stop on this book, but just encourage everybody else to read it. There's so much in it that's so relevant, I think. Although it's written a few years ago, I think there's so much that's so important for people to know today.
Yes, thank you. It is still as relevant.
All right.
Okay, quickly on to the next one. The next book I wrote was called The Argument Culture. This is my only book about public discourse, not the language of everyday conversation. And what inspired me to do it was with both Futures and Understand and Talking from 9 to 5. People were framing it, not always, many of it, it wasn't always, but sometimes I would go on a show and they would make it into a fight, or the headlines would say, Battle of the Sexes. Yeah. And my whole goal in everything I'm doing is peace treaty between the sexes. If you understand why others are speaking the way they are and that they're really kind of doing the same thing in a different way, you'll be less frustrated. You won't blame yourself or them or the relationship. And so the argument culture, I look at the press, politics, and the law. and education as well, how we are, and again, this was written in, believe it or not, in the late 90s, and it's only gotten worse, framing everything as a fight, approaching everything in an adversarial spirit. And in politics now, it's even back then I wrote how in the past there were friendships across party lines. Now it's actually forbidden. Alan Simpson's a Republican senator. He had retired and came back, and he was chastised because he went over to Democratic senators that had been his friends. Why are you talking to those guys? And in the press, it really takes two forms. The attack culture, it's valued more. And in my research, I really encountered journalists themselves talking about this. It's not so much that they're worried about readers, they're worried about their colleagues. That if they don't write aggressive, attacking, telling everything you do that's terrible, making everything into a scandal, they're afraid that their colleagues will think that they're rolled over, that they are writing puff pieces. And it used to be that the press, and this is not my own, not I'm the first one to write about this way, that the press used to be like a lapdog, right? They didn't really expose anything. And famous example that the journalists all knew that Franklin Roosevelt couldn't walk, but they never exposed it. But now they're attack dogs, and they should be watchdogs, something right in between. And the two sidesism, which is even, again, as dangerous today as it was back then, that everything is a fight between two warring camps. And so if you think that you're going to get better coverage, get more readers, if you talk about what's fascinating, have people fight, insult each other. And what happens is that when politicians themselves are doing things that are not aggressive, that are trying to work together, they don't get coverage. And the Holocaust denial, denying that the Holocaust ever existed, has had more success in this country than any other. And it seems to be because it has succeeded in masquerading as the other side in a debate. Deborah Lipstadt, who has written a book about this, talks about being invited on a show and they wanted her to debate Holocaust deniers. And she said, no, there's nothing to debate. And I don't want my appearance here to be to give them a platform. And she was told, well, don't you think people have a right to hear the other side? So that's, and again, many other aspects, that it was getting worse even then and now completely out of control. So that's the argument culture.
Well, let me say a little bit about it, and I won't spend time on this, even though I want to, because I want to talk to you about your dad and the book you wrote. Yes. But I do want to say, first of all, I just happened to pick this up this summer to read it, and it was written a long time ago, but because I'm a fan of other things you've written, I thought, well, look at this. And I had no idea that you'd written that. And then as I started to read it, I thought, boy, this describes today. I mean, it describes every cable news channel and everybody that's addicted to the sensationalism of this is what's horrible. And I can't believe anybody dares to run for office anymore because of the hard it is to keep your family safe, to not be attacked by, I don't care which party it is. I mean, parties are saying, we got to go after those people, I mean,
I talk about that in the past. You sacrifice a lot to go to public service, your private life and your income, but now you're putting your reputation at risk. Yes.
Well, the one thing I just want to say to people, I think it's a great book to understand where it comes from, because you talk about the Latin word for school and where it comes from, and it's a military origin, and how the people who were first, the priests and monks and in schools were coming out of a church where we were often usually before that soldiers, and so much of what we're doing has this, the metaphors we use, we got to go to war with these people, right? I mean, we just got to disagree, and so I think I think for whatever, it's been on steroids for the last number of years, it feels like to me. and it's dangerous, and it's scary to me. And that's why my show's on the air. That's why I'm trying to give people some hope about how to manage their own emotional stuff. Suggest to people that they don't watch so much cable news. I mean, you can watch once a night, just to find out what's going on. Just watch the news part, not all the opinion pieces, and then move on with your life. But so I encourage people to read your book again. Although the one thing I did want to ask about is because you did talk about China as having a more harmonious philosophy, and of course, in today's China, I don't see that happening. And I wonder what your thoughts were about that. And then I'll stop after that. But.
Yes. Actually, a student of mine wrote a dissertation about this, about Japanese, and she said they never have two experts. They have one, or they have three or more, so that they're not tempted to put it into that. The Asian culture in general is not as obsessed with this as a public way of doing things. It doesn't mean they're not hating each other and going to war, but I talk about the yin yang image. If it was us Western, we would have a line down the middle, yin yang. But what it is one curves into the other and has a little circle of the other within it. So I think Asian philosophy is less agonistic. I get the term from Walter Ong, who talks about Asian culture as being much more Irenistic, that is from Latin, peaceful. But you can use peaceful formats to tear each other down. I get it. I don't want to get carried away talking in too much detail about any of these, because we have a couple more to mention.
Okay, well, go ahead. I won't interrupt you now because I want to give you time to talk about your dad.
Okay, let me go quickly through the next 4 books, and I'll just give you one example of each. I then wanted to get back to personal relationships, and I wrote a book called I Only Say This Because I Love You, about adult family relationships. And I'll just give you one key example. It was a couple where they're in a restaurant, and the guy says he's going to order the steak, and the wife says, "Did you see they have salmon? Do you like salmon?" And he says, "Will you stop criticizing everything I eat?" And she said, "I'm not criticizing. I'm just trying to show you something you like." Of course, she was criticizing, because if she was happy with what he ordered, she wouldn't have said anything. But she also was showing caring. The doctor told him he should eat less red meat. She loves him. She doesn't want to lose him.
Right.
But this double meaning of, are you showing you're caring, or are you showing you're criticizing, which was true of all the family relationships I looked at, is what I ended up building on in the next book, which is Mothers and Daughters, called You're Wearing That. And I picked that because daughters say it to mothers as well as mothers to daughters. But again, that was the chapter about which I got the most questions, what everybody wanted to talk about. In my book, I Only Say This Because I Love You. And I remember this one journalist saying, "Well, why do mothers and daughters have so much trouble? We're both women." And I thought for a second, it's because we're both women. Women talk more about more personal topics and have more opportunity to say the wrong thing. And the biggest complaint from daughters of mothers was she's critical, and the biggest complaint from mothers about daughters, "I can't open my mouth. She takes everything as criticism." And it really is the caring and criticizing. Just one more quick anecdote. A woman told me, she's in her 60s. She said, "My mother's losing her eyesight, but she can still spot a pimple across the room." And I said, "I'm sure she comes over and says, here's this cream that I read about that's going to help, and maybe I bought you some." But who else looks at your face with that level of scrutiny? Yourself. And mothers and daughters do tend to look at each other as reflections of themselves, and subject each other to the same level of scrutiny to which we subject ourselves. But from the point of view of the daughter, here's the person you most want to think you're perfect, because what she says and what she thinks matters so much. And from the point of view of the mother, here's the person you most want to help. But any suggestion and offer of help is indirect criticism. So I try to piece all that together in that book.
I've spent a lot of time trying to understand if I have a conversation that I want to have with someone and it's a challenging conversation for whatever reason, multiple possibilities for different reasons that might be challenging. How do I want them to feel when I talk to them? And how am I going to feel? And I think part of making them feel differently is understanding the different styles that you talk about. And style is not just men and women, but so many different multiple variables that you talk about, whether it's geography, different countries, different cultures, different religions, and so forth. So again, I encourage lots of people to, if they haven't read you before, to get, go to the library, buy your book.
Yes, thank you. The subtitle is his century-long journey from World War I, Warsaw, and then my quest to follow. My father was born in Warsaw in 1908 into a Hasidic family. Now, when we say Hasidim today, we think of a marginal sect, but Jews at that time in Warsaw were more than half the population, and more than half of the Jews were Hasidim. But my father came to this country in 1920, and he lived to be 98. So he pretty much lived the entire 20th century. And his life reflects all the cataclysmic events of that century. And really, it's all stuff that I knew, but putting everything into context made me understand him in a completely new way. And of course, myself, because when you learn your heritage, you learn where you came from. But my father had no father. His father had died of tuberculosis when he was 6, but the father had moved out when he was 2 because of the tuberculosis, because they lived in one room. His mother, his sister, and until he moved out, the father. And this was a room in the household of my father's grandparents, so his mother's parents. And his mother was one of 16 or 18 siblings, depend on how you count. I can tell you the life stories of 13 of them, and I can name up to 18 if I include ones that died before adulthood. And yes, several of my grandmother's sisters had astonishing lives. You think of women in the old country, especially Hasidism, that they would be all at home cooking, and they all but one got secular education. So my grandmother founded and was the principal of a school, in fact, the first school for Hasidic girls in Warsaw, probably in Poland. One of her sisters had studied physics and chemistry in Zurich with Einstein, had become his lover. Later, when she was in this country, and then Einstein later came to Princeton and his wife died, she went to Princeton to be with him. Apparently their affair rekindled, and she became pregnant by him and had an abortion. She was sure he would marry her when his wife died, but after his wife died, but he did not. Other sister was a dentist, first woman periodontist and dentist in New York. And so they were quite educated and fascinating. The women were educated, their brothers were not. My father spoke Polish to his mother and aunts, and Yiddish to his uncles and grandparents. Apparently the uncles didn't speak Polish very well. And apparently that's because the only thing that mattered for them was religious education. And the way my father explained it was the girls didn't matter, so they were allowed to go get educated. Now, how did they get educated if my grandmother started the first school for Hasidic girls? That is a mystery I haven't quite found the answer to. But I think many of them, they all gave up Hasidism. And this is kind of interesting. I initially thought the book I was going to write about my father was about the Hasidic community of Warsaw he was raised in. He had astonishingly detailed memories of that life and that world. And some of the reviewers of my book are particularly talk about that, and I only gave you a tiny bit of what he remembered. I thought that I was going to bring back to life and preserve that Hasidic, the Jewish Warsaw that was destroyed by the Nazis in World War II. But in reading about the period in connection with writing the book, I learned that it was actually World War I that was the end of that world. And when I thought about it, I realized, yeah, all those aunts and uncles gave up Hasidism. Only the oldest sister and one of the younger brothers stayed Hasidic. So really that world was ending, and it's kind of fascinating. Okay, so my father comes to this country in 1920, and that's really fascinating because I always knew it was unusual that my parents were born in Europe. My mother in Russia also came around the age of 11. And all my other people my age, it was their grandparents. And it wasn't until I began, again, doing the research for the book that I realized the year my father came, 1920, was the last year there were no limits on immigration. Because he had no father, my father had to quit high school at 14, went to work in the garment district. This is another fascinating thing. There were factories in New York. Immigrants could get jobs in these factories. The conditions were terrible, but they could. And when you think about it, a 14-year-old boy could get a job and support his mother and sister. They were poor, but he was able to support them. He went to high school at night. That is, he took high school equivalency tests at night, went to law school at night, got his law degree, got a master's in law, passed the bar, but it was the Depression. And so his life story is very much, from his point of view, this struggle to have to actually earn his living as a lawyer. When he sat down after retirement to write his life, he started by making a list of all the jobs he had held and work he had done, and it came to 68. And a lot of it was during the Depression, and quite dramatic jobs. There's one, he was an alcohol tax inspector, and in his description, his memory was surreal. He wrote, after he wrote these 68 jobs, he wrote or dictated detailed descriptions of each one. And about this one, he said, "I held my gun hard and waited." What? Gun? I never heard my father raise his voice. He was the most kind, gentle, even-tempered. But yeah, he was carrying a gun. They were chasing bootleggers. And he was a prison guard and a parole officer at the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. And so really, from my father's point of view, when he looked back on all these jobs, he was proud that he had done what he had to do. And I came to understand that that's all he ever asked, what he had to do. He never asked what he wanted to do, as I have had the luxury in my life to ask. And so because of the Depression and wrong decisions that he made, he ended up not really being able to support his family as a lawyer until he was 50 and I was in junior high school. I start one chapter on this. A journalist who had interviewed me called me and said, "Something I have here in my notes doesn't make any sense. You say your father was a lawyer and you say you were raised working class. How can that be?" Well, until I was in junior high, my father was a cutter in the garment district. And after I was in junior high, he was a lawyer. The brief story of that is he became active in politics in order to get a political appointment as a way to, because he couldn't leave his family with no means of support. And he was supposed to, he was promised he would get an appointment in a year and then another, and it was 13 years before he finally did. And then he gets this political appointment as an assistant counsel to the Workmen's Compensation Board. And less than a year later, total shock. This never happened in New York State. A Republican is elected governor, Rockefeller, and he loses the position. But at that point, he sets up his own law practice. And I do explain how he was able to do that. So, and my father was a communist. I have his FBI file. They did not find him. They did not uncover that he was a communist, which he had been. And he did become disillusioned with communism. He told me that when he came to this country at 12, he was already self-identified as an atheist, a communist, and a Zionist. He became ever more passionate about his Zionism, but he did give up, and his atheism. Those two went together, of course. Very Jewish identified, but he gave up the organized religion, and he was disillusioned with communism. Although when he was 97, he was reading a biography of Stalin, and he said, communism didn't fail, it was never tried.
I remember reading that. Yeah, that's pretty powerful.
And then I'll tell just one more, and then you can ask me anything you want. But another big mystery, and I have quite a long chapter about this. Many people tell me it's their favorite. There was a woman that my father might have married instead of my mother. Both my parents talked about her. She was not a secret. I call her Helen, that's his pseudonym. So the question of why he married my mother and not her, at one point he said to me, oh, your mother wasn't my girlfriend, Helen was my girlfriend. So why did he marry my mother and not Helen? And so that is a mystery that I unravel. My father told me at one point that he had saved Helen's letters, but didn't know where they were. But if he could find them, he would give them to me. And I did eventually find them, and he let me keep them. And so I traced the relationship in those letters. And yeah, so that's maybe it's we all have these alternate lives. I did start out thinking my parents were not well matched. Maybe Helen would have been better matched. The fact that if my father had married Helen, I wouldn't be here didn't quite figure in my thinking, but I think a lot of thinking is magical thinking. I kind of realized on some level, I was thinking, well, maybe if he had married Helen, she would have been my mother. Obviously, that was not accurate. But I do unravel that mystery by reading their letters, which are quite astonishing. I not only found her letters, but he had kept copies of many of his letters to her. He was a hoarder. I think he saved every piece of paper that came into his life. So I have copies of many letters that he wrote and many, many letters that he received. So mountains and mountains of words that my father left me. He was a man of words. And although he was never a professional writer, he was a wonderful writer and clearly loved writing. So I got that from him. So the last thing I'll say is, when I was a kid, my father was never home. He was either at work or doing his political work. And I'm the youngest of three. So even if he was home, he didn't have a lot of time just for me. And so deciding that I would write this book about him, which he wanted me to write, I think it was kind of part of his hoarding. He saved everything and he wrote all this stuff. And where was it going to go? Well, if I write a book about him, doesn't go to waste. But by writing the book about him, I was able to keep him with me, and all the hours we spent talking, and I have 200 cassette tapes of interviews and conversations with him. I would never, I'm a workaholic, take off in the middle of the day to go spend hours talking to my family unless it was the purpose to write a book. So that gave me an excuse to spend all those hours talking to him about his past. And he loved to talk about his past. I think it was nice for him that I wanted to listen.
I think so too. Let me say I'm going to have to end here, but let me just close with a couple of comments about the book. First, I enjoyed reading it a lot. I thought of your dad when he was a very funny man on occasion. And when some of the things that you wrote that he said, it would just caused me to laugh out loud. And also, he was a very dedicated man to providing for his mom and his sister, and then for you and your family. And so he constantly found ways to make things happen. I think it actually started from the time he was 12, delivering telegrams, if I remember right.
Yes, that's right.
He was bringing tips home for your mom. For his mom. And then I think that the other thing that I came to really appreciate was your mom and her family, and how important that warmth was for him to actually be able to move on from his mom and his sister, because that might not have never happened if your mom
Yes.
had figured out how to get him to marry her. So.
Yes, let me just say a word about that. Yes. And this is something I really came to understand in writing the book. Why was he so obsessed with his childhood in Warsaw? Why did he remember it in such detail? Talk about it with such nostalgia. And I came to the conclusion he was part of a community there, living in this big family with all these aunts and uncles. As he once said, you couldn't walk out of the house without running into a relative. In this country, it was reduced to just his mother and his sister. And it was a very unhappy household. His mother, I again figured out. My father also gave me journals he had kept from before he was married. She was clearly very depressed. So it was a very unhappy household. But he would never have reneged on his responsibility to take care of them, except for what he perceived as a greater responsibility. So my mother succeeded in convincing him that he had a greater responsibility toward her. And I think that she saved him because, together they did create that family that he missed so much from his childhood.
And where can they get your book, Deborah? Where can people find your book if they want to buy your book, or any of your books?
Well, any bookstore will have it. Of course, I hope people will buy it in independent bookstores, but Amazon does, of course, have it as well. And it's Valentine's, so you can get it on their website as well.
Well, okay. I want to say thank you, Deborah, for being my guest. It's been just a real delight to have you. And I want to say thank you to my listeners. I've been listening to WPKN 89.5 FM in Bridgeport, Connecticut, community-sponsored radio, and it's sponsored by all of you. So thanks very much. And thanks for being here, Deborah.
Thank you so much.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.